The old music building had a life of its own, and it breathed most loudly in the evenings. During the day, it was a place of structured learning, of stern professors correcting posture and timing. But when the sun began to set, it transformed. The long, polished hallways seemed to hum with a different kind of energy, a chaotic and beautiful symphony of ambition. This was the students' time. They were the lifeblood of the conservatory, young and filled with a fire that made their eyes shine and their fingers fly across ivory keys. They moved through the building like a river, flowing from one practice room to another, their arms cradling violins and cellos, their backpacks heavy with books and sheet music covered in frantic pencil marks. They spoke a language of their own, of cadenzas and arpeggios, of auditions and recitals, of the fierce, burning hope that one day the world would know their name. And in the middle of this rushing river of talent and dreams was the old man. He was 68, though the years seemed to have settled not just on his face but on his very shoulders, giving him a permanent, gentle stoop. He was the nighttime cleaner, and his world was the silent echo of theirs. He arrived as the last of the daytime professors were leaving, pushing a large, gray cart that rattled softly with his supplies. The students barely registered his presence. To them, he was just part of the building's machinery, like the heater that clicked on in the winter or the lights that flickered sometimes. He was a quiet figure in a worn blue uniform, a background element in the grand drama of their own lives. His routine was a dance he had performed for years, a silent ballet of mops and dusters. He would start at the top floor, working his way down. The first thing he always did was empty the small trash cans in each practice room. It was amazing what he found. Crumpled up pages of sheet music, sometimes torn in frustration, a single, angry red X drawn across a particularly difficult measure. Empty coffee cups and energy drink cans, the fuel for late-night practice sessions. Once, he even found a single, lonely earring on the floor next to a piano. He picked it up and placed it carefully on the windowsill, knowing its owner would be back for it. He was a silent witness to their struggles and their passions. Seeing the evidence of their long hours in the overflowing bins and the scuff marks on the floor where a pianist had pumped their pedals with furious intensity as he worked. The muffled sounds of music would seep from under the doors, a violin playing a scale over and over, each time a little faster, a piano playing a haunting melody that was full of mistakes but also full of feeling. He would pause sometimes, his hand on his mop, and just listen. He didn't know the names of the pieces, but he understood the language. He could hear the frustration in a series of jagged, angry chords and the breakthrough in a long, flowing run of notes that suddenly came out right. He felt a sort of quiet pride for them, these young people he didn't know. He saw how hard they worked, how they poured every ounce of themselves into their music, but they never saw him. A young woman with a messy bun and intense eyes would walk right past him, her phone pressed to her ear, arguing with someone about a tempo. She wouldn't even glance his way. A group of young men, laughing and shoving each other playfully, would part around him like water or around a stone and then close back up, their conversation never missing a beat. He was invisible. It wasn't that they were mean or rude. It was just that he was so far outside of their world, so completely disconnected from their goals and their lives, that their minds simply didn't register him as a person to be acknowledged. He was the cleaner, a function, a task to be completed after they had gone. He didn't mind it, not really. He was a quiet man who had lived a quiet life. He found a certain peace in the solitude of his work. He liked the building best when it was empty, when the last student had finally gone home and the only sound was the gentle hum of the lights and the soft squeak of his mop on the floor. That was when the building felt truly his. He would move through the silent hallways, his footsteps the only rhythm in the vast, sleeping space. He took his time, polishing the wood of the banisters until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights, wiping down the doors until they were free of smudges. He treated the building with a care that no one else saw, a respect for the history and the music that lived within its walls. His favorite part of the whole building was the main auditorium. It was a large, impressive room with red velvet seats and a huge, gleaming grand piano that sat center stage. Most nights, after he had swept and mopped the floors, he would stand at the back of the dark room and just look at it. The moonlight would sometimes stream through the high windows, illuminating the polished black wood of the piano, making it look almost magical. He would stand there for a long time, his cleaning cart forgotten in the aisle. He wouldn't go on the stage. He never touched the piano. He would just look at it, and a look would come over his face, a complicated mix of things. A little bit of sadness, a little bit of longing, and a deep, profound love. It was a look that told a story the students, in their hurry to become the future, would never have time to understand. Then, with a soft sigh that was almost lost in the vastness of the empty room, he would turn and walk away, flicking off the lights one by one, plunging the auditorium into darkness before locking the heavy doors for the night. The pressure inside the music conservatory was building, and you could feel it in the air like a coming storm. It was the week of the annual concerto competition, the one event that could make a student's career or break their spirit. Posters were plastered on every bulletin board, and conversations in the hallways were filled with nervous energy and whispered predictions. For one young man in particular, the pressure was almost too much to bear. He was a pianist, barely 20, with a talent that was both a gift and a curse. His fingers could dance across the keys with a speed and precision that others could only dream of, but lately, that wasn't enough. He was in the main auditorium, the huge, empty room echoing with the sound of his own frustration. He was trying to master Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece of music that was famous for its technical difficulty and its deep, soulful emotion. He could play every single note perfectly. His runs were flawless, his chords were powerful, and his timing was exact. But it felt empty. It was like a beautifully painted robot that looked human but had no heart. He would finish a passage, his chest heaving, and slam his hands down on the keys in anger, producing a discordant crash that reverberated through the silent hall. His professor had told him the same thing just that afternoon. "Technically, it's brilliant," the old man had said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you're not telling a story. You're just reciting the words. This music, it comes from a place of deep sadness and then a slow, powerful hope. You have to feel it. You have to live it. Right now, you're just shouting the notes." The young pianist had nodded, his jaw tight, but the words had stung. He felt like a fraud. He had all the skill, but he was missing the one thing that truly mattered. So he practiced. He practiced for hours until his fingers ached and his back was sore. He tried to force the emotion out, thinking that if he just played louder, or faster, or with more dramatic movements, the feeling would magically appear. But it didn't. The more he pushed, the more the music resisted him. It was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The evening wore on, and the auditorium grew darker as the sun set outside the tall windows. The only light was the single, warm lamp over the piano, which cast long, dancing shadows across the empty seats. Finally, after yet another failed attempt at a particularly emotional passage, he snapped. He let out a yell of pure frustration and grabbed the thick stack of sheet music from the stand. He crumpled it in his hands, wanting to tear it to shreds, but something stopped him. It was his personal copy, covered in years of his own pencil marks, fingerings, and notes. It was a map of his musical journey. With a final, angry sigh, he threw the music down onto the piano bench. He didn't even bother to turn off the lamp. He just stormed out of the auditorium, his footsteps echoing his anger down the long, empty hallway, leaving the grand piano to sit alone in the pool of light. Hours later, when the building was silent and the moon was high in the sky, the old cleaner began his rounds. He moved through the hallways with his quiet, familiar rhythm, his cart rattling softly behind him. He emptied the trash cans and wiped down the surfaces, his movements practiced and efficient. When he pushed his cart into the main auditorium, he stopped. The lamp over the piano was still on, casting a lonely glow on the stage. He frowned slightly. Students were usually good about turning off the lights. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. As he got closer, he saw the sheet music lying on the bench. It was a mess, the pages crumpled and askew. He picked it up gently, his hands rough from years of work, and carefully smoothed out the pages. He recognized the title immediately. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. He didn't need to read the notes. He knew them by heart. A wave of something, a mix of nostalgia and a deep old ache washed over him. He stood there for a long moment, just holding the music. His eyes distant, he looked at the young pianist's notes on the page, the frantic pencil marks that showed a desperate search for something. He saw the little reminders to crescendo here or slow down, more feeling. He understood that struggle. He understood it more than anyone. He walked over to the piano and placed the sheet music back on the stand, straightening it so every page was perfectly aligned. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, looking at the notes, his shadow falling over the keys like a ghost. His fingers, gnarled with arthritis and stained from years of cleaning, hovered over the ivory keys. He didn't press them. He just traced the shape of the melody in the air, his fingers moving in a slow, graceful dance. He closed his eyes, and for a second he wasn't a 68-year-old cleaner in an empty auditorium. He was a young man again, with the whole world ahead of him. He could feel the smooth, cool wood of a different piano under his fingers, could hear the roar of an audience, could feel the thrill of the music flowing through him, not from his mind, but from his soul. A single, sad smile touched his lips before it faded away. He opened his eyes, and the illusion was gone. He was just an old man in a dark room. He let out a long, slow breath, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 50 years. He looked at the music one last time, a look of profound love and profound loss in his eyes. Then he turned away from the piano, picked up his cleaning cart, and resumed his work, the soft squeak of his mop the only sound in the vast, silent hall. But as he worked, his movements were a little slower, a little more thoughtful, as if he were carrying a melody with him in the quiet darkness. About an hour had passed since the young pianist had stormed out of the auditorium. He was now sitting in a small, sterile practice room with a couple of his friends, one of whom played the violin and the other the cello. He was slumped over a cheap, upright piano, listlessly picking out a simple tune, the fire from earlier completely gone. He felt hollowed out, defeated. His friends were trying their best to cheer him up, telling him stories of their own frustrating practice sessions and offering him snacks from a vending machine, but their words were just noise. He wasn't really listening. His mind was stuck in the main auditorium, replaying his own angry, lifeless performance. He felt like a complete fraud, pretending to be a musician when he couldn't even find the heart in one of the most passionate pieces ever written. Suddenly, his eyes shot open. A jolt of panic went through him. "My music," he said, his voice flat. "I left my sheet music on the bench." His friends looked at him, confused. "So, just get it tomorrow," the violinist suggested. But the pianist was already shaking his head. "No, you don't understand. That's my copy. All my notes, my fingerings, everything I've figured out for the last 2 years is on those pages. I can't play without it." It was more than just paper. It was his security blanket, his roadmap. The thought of losing it was a new kind of terror on top of his existing frustration. He stood up, grabbing his jacket. "I have to go back." His friends, seeing the real distress on his face, immediately offered to go with him. "We'll come with you," the cellist said. "It's late, and this place is creepy at night." Grateful, the three of them set out, walking through the quiet, sleeping campus. The night air was cool, and the only sounds were their footsteps crunching on the gravel paths and the distant chirping of crickets. The huge, dark shape of the music building loomed in front of them, looking less like a place of creativity and more like a silent, sleeping giant. The pianist used his keycard to open a side door, and they stepped into the familiar but now unsettling silence of the empty hallway. The building felt completely different at night. The familiar hum of activity was gone, replaced by a profound stillness that made their own breathing seem loud. The emergency lights cast long, eerie shadows down the corridors. As they walked towards the main auditorium, the pianist started to feel a sense of dread. He just wanted to grab his music and get out, to escape the place that had become a symbol of his failure. But then, as they rounded the corner, they all stopped. A faint sound was drifting down the hall. It was the sound of a piano. They looked at each other, confused. "Is someone else practicing?" the violinist whispered. It was well past midnight. The building was supposed to be empty. The pianist shook his head. "Everyone goes home by now. It must be a radio or something." But as they walked closer, the sound grew clearer, and he realized it wasn't a radio. It was live. The sound had a richness, a depth that a recording couldn't capture. It was coming from the main auditorium. His heart started to beat a little faster. Who would be in there? They approached the heavy double doors of the auditorium, and the music washed over them, powerful and clear. The pianist froze, his hand reaching for the door handle but stopping in midair. He recognized the piece instantly. It was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was his piece. But it wasn't his version. This was different. This was breathtaking. The notes he had been struggling with, the ones he had been hammering out with brute force, were flowing out of the piano with an effortless grace. The music wasn't just being played. It was being breathed into existence. It was filled with a longing and a sadness so profound it made his chest ache. He had never heard anything like it. Curiosity and a strange sense of awe overcame his frustration. He motioned for his friends to be quiet and carefully, slowly pushed one of the heavy doors open just a crack. Peering through, they saw the stage. The auditorium was almost completely dark, except for the single lamp over the piano and the faint, silvery moonlight streaming through the high windows. And sitting at the grand piano, his back to them, was a small, hunched figure. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust, for their brains to process the impossible scene. It was the old man. The cleaner got the three students stood frozen in the doorway, their minds struggling to catch up with what their eyes and ears were telling them. The quiet, invisible man who mopped the floors and emptied their trash was sitting at the most revered piano in the conservatory, playing with the soul of a master. They watched, completely mesmerized. His posture was not that of a trained pianist. He was slumped over, his movements seemingly clumsy. His hands, which they knew were wrinkled and worn from years of physical labor, moved across the keys with a surprising gentleness and an intimate knowledge. They weren't the hands of a technician. They were the hands of a storyteller. He wasn't playing the piece with perfect, sterile precision. There was a slight tremor in some of the fast passages, a hint of roughness around the edges. But it didn't matter. In fact, it made it more beautiful. The music was raw and honest, full of the imperfections of a real life. Every note seemed to carry a memory, a feeling, a story. The young pianist felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He had been trying to manufacture emotion, but this man was simply letting it pour out of him. The music was a confession, a lifetime of joy and sorrow, of dreams chased and dreams lost, all poured into the keys in the middle of the night. When no one was supposed to be listening, the cellist beside him had tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her mouth as if to stifle a sob. The violinist just stood with his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with disbelief. They were witnessing something sacred, something they were never meant to see. The old man played on, lost in his own world, completely unaware of his audience. He was not playing for them or for anyone. He was playing for himself, for the ghost of the person he might have been, for the music that had clearly lived inside him for his entire life. The final chords of the piece faded into the air, and a profound, heavy silence filled the vast, dark room. The three students didn't dare move, barely dared to breathe, afraid to break the spell. They just stood there in the doorway, their world completely tilted on its axis, forever changed by the secret performance of a 68-year-old cleaner. The final note of the concerto hung in the air of the vast, dark auditorium, a shimmering ghost that slowly faded into complete and utter silence. It was a heavy, sacred silence, the kind that feels like it has a weight and a presence all its own. The three students stood frozen in the doorway, trapped in the moment, their minds struggling to process the profound beauty they had just witnessed. The young pianist felt a knot in his throat, a mix of awe and a deep, piercing shame. He had been wrestling with this music for months, trying to force it to bend to his will, and this old man had just unlocked its soul with an effortless grace that was both humbling and devastating. The spell was broken by a soft, accidental thud. The cellist, overwhelmed with emotion, had shifted her weight, and her heavy bag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. In the profound silence of the hall, it sounded like a gunshot. The figure at the piano jumped as if he'd been struck. His shoulders hunched, and he twisted around on the bench, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear, like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, nobody moved. The old man stared at the three silhouettes in the doorway, and they stared back at him, the moonlight casting them all in a pale, ethereal glow. A deep blush of embarrassment crept up the old man's neck. He quickly pulled his hands from the keys as if they were burned and hid them in his lap, a gesture of such vulnerability that it made the young pianist's heart ache. I'm sorry," the old man stammered, his voice raspy from disuse. He stood up, avoiding their gaze, and started fussing with his cleaning cart, which was parked at the edge of the stage. "I was just fooling around. I hope I didn't disturb you. I'll be out of your way in a minute." His words were a rush, a desperate attempt to erase the moment, to shove the beautiful, raw thing they had just witnessed back into its hidden box, but the young pianist couldn't let it go. He took a hesitant step forward into the auditorium, his friends right behind him. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it was clear and steady in the silent room. "Please, don't be sorry." He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps soft on the carpet. He felt like he was approaching a wild, beautiful creature that might bolt at any second. He struggled to find the right word, but none seemed big enough. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." The old man stopped his frantic fussing and looked at the young man, his expression wary and uncertain. He saw the sincerity in the student's eyes, and it seemed to confuse him. He was used to being ignored, to being part of the scenery. He wasn't used to being seen, let alone praised. The cellist and the violinist came forward as well, their faces filled with a reverence that was unmistakable. "We didn't mean to spy," the cellist said gently. We heard the music and we couldn't stay away." The old man's shoulders seemed to relax just a fraction. He looked from one young face to another, seeing not judgment, but genuine, unfiltered awe. He let out a long, slow breath, the tension leaving his body in a rush. He gestured vaguely towards the piano bench. "It's an old habit," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured. "Hard to break." The young pianist reached the stage and looked up at him. "I'm the one who should be sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's my music. That's the piece I've been trying to play. And I couldn't do it. I was just making noise. You made it sing?" He looked down at his own hands, then back at the old man. How do you do that?" The old man looked at the grand piano, his expression softening into something sad and distant. He seemed to be looking not at the polished wood and ivory keys, but through them into another time, another life. He slowly sat back down on the bench, not to play, but just to sit. The students remained where they were, giving him space, sensing that a story was about to unfold. "It's a long story," the old man said, his eyes still fixed on the piano. "Not a very interesting one." He paused, tracing a crack in the wooden floor with his worn-out shoe. "A long, long time ago, when I was about your age," he began, his voice taking on a dreamy quality, "I was going to be a pianist. That was all I ever wanted. I practiced day and night. My hands, they were fast then. Not like now." He held up his arthritic, gnarled hands, a stark contrast to the elegant music they had just produced. "I got a scholarship. A full ride to a very famous school back east. All my dreams were coming true." He fell silent, and the auditorium was so quiet they could hear the faint hum of the emergency lights. "But life doesn't always care about your dreams," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "My father, he worked in a factory. He got sick, really sick. And my mother, she wasn't well either. Someone had to take care of them. And my little sister and brother, they were just kids. They needed someone to put food on the table. He shrugged, a simple, devastating gesture. So I came home. I told myself I'd go back. I told myself I'd just work for a year, save some money, and then I'd go back to New York. But a year turned into 2, then 5, then 10. My parents passed away. My siblings grew up and had families of their own. And somewhere along the way, the dream just faded. The students listened, completely captivated. They were seeing the invisible man in a completely new light. He wasn't just a cleaner. He was a man who had sacrificed his entire future for his family. The young pianist felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him for all the times he had walked past this man without a second glance. I never stopped loving it. Though, the old man said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. The music. I'd listen to it on the radio. I'd buy the old records. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd play on this little upright we had. My audience went from thousands in my dreams to just me. And then even that stopped. He looked around the empty auditorium. But this place, it has so many pianos. And at night it's so quiet. Sometimes when I know everyone's gone home, I just can't resist. It's like a part of me wakes up again. The young pianist finally climbed the few steps onto the stage. He didn't say anything. He just walked over to the old man and stood beside him, looking at the sheet music on the stand. He pointed to a particularly difficult passage. My professor told me I was missing the soul, he said softly. He said I was just shouting the notes. I think I understand what he means now. He looked at the old man, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. You didn't just play the music. You lived it. The old man looked at the young man, and for the first time he saw not a student, but a fellow musician. He saw the same fire, the same passion that he once had. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it on the young pianist's shoulder. You have the talent, he said, his voice firm with a quiet authority. Don't you ever waste it. Don't let life get in the way. Not if you can help it. It's a precious gift. He gave the young man's shoulder a gentle squeeze, then stood up. Now, I really should finish my work. The sun will be up soon. He walked back to his cart, but this time he didn't seem like an invisible cleaner. He seemed like a wise old teacher, a hidden master, and the 3 students watched him go, knowing that they had just been given a lesson that no classroom could ever teach. The walk back to the dormitories that night was silent. The 3 students moved through the sleeping campus as if in a daze, the old man's music still echoing in their ears. The world looked the same trees, the same buildings, the same paths, but for them everything had changed. The young pianist felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him, shame for his own arrogance, awe at the hidden talent he had witnessed, and a profound sense of sadness for a life unlived. He kept replaying the old man's words in his mind. Don't let life get in the way. It was a simple piece of advice. But it felt like the most important lesson he had ever learned. The next day, something was different. When the young pianist sat down at the piano in his practice room, he didn't attack the keys. He approached them with a new kind of gentleness, a new respect. He closed his eyes and thought about the old man's story. He thought about the sacrifice, the lost dreams, the quiet dignity of a life spent in service to others. And then he began to play. The Rachmaninoff concerto flowed from his fingers, not as a series of technical challenges to be conquered, but as a story to be told. The music was no longer empty. It was filled with a new depth, a new understanding. It was filled with empathy. His friends, who were listening outside the door, exchanged a look of amazement. He had found it. He had found the soul. The story of the midnight recital was too big, too incredible to keep to themselves. The 3 students tried, they really did. They had promised the old man they wouldn't say anything. But in the hallways, in the cafeteria, they found themselves talking about it in hushed, excited tones. They never said it was the cleaner. They just spoke of a mysterious pianist they had heard by chance, a ghost who played with more heart than anyone they had ever heard. The legend of the midnight pianist began to spread through the conservatory like wildfire. It became a kind of myth, a secret hope for every student who felt they were struggling. Some students even started staying late, wandering the quiet hallways, hoping to catch a glimpse of the phantom musician. The most significant change, however, was in the young pianist playing. His professor noticed it almost immediately. A week after the midnight recital, the professor called the young man into his office. "I don't know what you've done," the professor said, a look of genuine wonder on his face, "but you found it. The music is alive, it's breathing. What happened? What was the breakthrough?" The young pianist hesitated, feeling a loyalty to the old man's secret. But looking at his professor, he knew he had to share the truth. He took a deep breath and told him everything. He told him about the forgotten sheet music, the walk back to the auditorium, and the incredible, secret performance of the 68-year-old cleaner. He told him the story of the lost scholarship and the life of sacrifice. The professor listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When the young man finished, the professor leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. He didn't seem shocked. He seemed moved. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice soft. "Some of the greatest gifts are the ones we keep hidden, but sometimes a gift is too precious not to be shared." He didn't say anything more, but his words hung in the air, a quiet permission, a gentle nudge. The students took this as their cue. The young pianist, the cellist, the violinist, and the small group of friends who now knew the truth decided they had to do something. They couldn't let this incredible talent remain a secret, hidden away in the dark. They wanted to give him the one thing he had lost, an audience. They wanted to give him a proper thank you. Their plan was simple and heartfelt. They designed simple, anonymous posters and put them up all over the conservatory. They just said, "A special performance. You don't want to miss this? Main auditorium. Friday night." There was no name, no details. Just a promise of something special. On Friday night, the students had to figure out how to get the old man to the auditorium. They decided to be honest. The young pianist found him finishing up his work in a hallway. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful, "we've organized a small, informal concert. Just for the students, and we would be incredibly honored if you would play for us." The old man looked at him, his eyes wide with alarm. He shook his head. "Oh, no, I couldn't. I'm not a performer. I'm just, an old man who likes to fool around." But the young pianist was persistent. "Please," he begged. "You've already given us so much. Just let us give something back to you. Let us listen." Finally, reluctantly, the old man agreed. When he walked into the auditorium, he stopped dead in his tracks. The room was not empty. It was filled to capacity with students and faculty, all sitting in a hushed, expectant silence. They weren't dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns. They were in jeans and sweaters, but their attention was absolute. They were his audience. The ones who had rushed past him in the hallways for years were now looking at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated respect. He saw the young pianist in the front row, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, as if in a dream, the old man walked onto the stage and sat down at the grand piano. He placed his arthritic, trembling hands on the keys, and for a moment he just sat there looking out at the sea of young faces. Then he began to play. The music that filled the hall was the same raw, beautiful, honest music they had heard that night, but this time it was amplified by the shared experience. It was no longer a secret confession. It was a gift freely given. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the entire auditorium erupted. The students jumped to their feet, their applause a thunderous, joyful roar that filled the room, a standing ovation not for a famous virtuoso, but for a quiet man who had never lost his love for the music. It was a standing ovation 50 years overdue, and as the old man stood up and bowed, his face wet with tears, he was no longer the invisible cleaner. He was the maestro, finally seen, finally heard, and finally home.